I remember the first time I truly believed that things could be different, that my financial story didn't have to be the same script I'd been replaying for years. Maybe it was a new job opportunity or a sudden idea that sparked excitement, something that made me think, this time, I'm going to get it right. I could taste the possibility of stability, of finally feeling in control instead of always chasing after something just out of reach. But then, something shifted. It wasn't dramatic at first, no loud alarms or catastrophic events, but I felt myself pulling back, retreating into the familiar comfort of hesitation. I started making excuses, small at first. I'll start later. This isn't the right moment. Maybe I'm not ready. Then came the tiny mistakes, missing a deadline, overlooking an important detail, convincing myself that minor slip-ups didn't matter much. But they did. They stacked up quietly, creating a barrier between me and what I really wanted. It felt like a slow unraveling, a secret sabotage orchestrated by my own hands. And when the inevitable fallout came, failed plans, lost opportunities, I heard the voice inside me whisper, I knew this would happen. It was a strange kind of relief, a shield against deeper pain. If I expected failure, if I was the one who stepped back before trying, it hurt less. This invisible protection became a pattern, like a fortress built around the parts of me that wanted to hope, but were afraid to risk. I know this story because it's mine, but I also see it unfolding around me, in friends, family, even strangers who tell me about their financial dreams stalled by unseen forces. It's not just about making the wrong moves or lacking discipline. It's something deeper, quieter, an emotional script that runs beneath our decisions, shaping how we act before we even realize it. I remember a conversation with a close friend, someone I'd always thought had their life figured out. She told me about a business idea she abandoned after months of preparation. I just didn't believe I'd succeed, she confessed. So, at some point, I started procrastinating, not returning emails, ignoring potential clients. It was like I was waiting for the failure to come, so I wouldn't be caught off guard. Her words echoed my own experience, the same subtle dance of avoidance. What struck me is how this isn't about laziness or lack of ambition. This is about self-preservation, even if it's paradoxical. The mind and heart find creative ways to protect us from pain we're not fully conscious of. But that protection carries a heavy price, a slow suffocation of potential. We get stuck, watching chances slip away while convincing ourselves it's safer not to try. There's a hero in all of us, a part that dreams of more. I see that hero in my reflection, the part that craves breakthrough, that wants to rewrite the story. But that same hero also bears scars from past wounds, invisible marks left by disappointment, unmet promises, maybe even hidden fears learned long ago. Those scars whisper doubts louder than our courage sometimes. So here I am, sitting with this contradiction, wanting to move forward but holding myself back. It feels like standing at a doorway, hesitant to step through because the past rooms were filled with shadows. And yet, I know that remaining frozen isn't the answer either. There's a tension between the familiar pain of staying still and the unknown risk of trying again. I wonder if you felt this too, the urge to reach for something better, only to falter just as success seems within grasp. Maybe you've caught yourself dreaming of stability, then slipping into patterns that keep you from actually building it. It's like a silent battle inside, one that plays out in choices small and large, how you spend, save, invest, or even whether you dare to pursue that opportunity that feels both exciting and terrifying. It's tempting to write off these moments as mere procrastination or poor decisions. But what if there's something more? What if these are signals from a deeper part of ourselves crying out for understanding? I've come to realize that beneath those mistakes and delays lies a story of protection, a way our psyche tries to shelter us from the sting of disappointment that once cut too deep. Acknowledging this isn't easy. It means facing the very thing we often hide from, a quiet, persistent fear that failure isn't just external. It feels personal, like a wound in our identity. And so, we build walls, sometimes so high we don't even see the door anymore. But I believe that recognition, simply seeing the pattern, can start to shift everything. There's a way forward that doesn't deny the past, but gently transforms it. That's why I want to take this journey with you, to explore where this self-sabotage comes from and how it shapes us. Because once we start to shine a light on these hidden dynamics, something changes. the cycle loosens its grip and new possibilities emerge. I'm not promising quick fixes or magic answers. This is a slow unfolding, a tender process of discovery and healing. But just by sitting with these truths, by naming what's been silent for too long, we carve out a space for hope. And hope, after all, is where any story begins to rewrite itself. When I look back, I realize how often my mind played tricks on me just moments before I was supposed to take a leap. It was like standing at the edge of a cliff, heart pounding, fists clenched, ready to dive, only to suddenly find reasons why the water might be too cold, too shallow, or filled with dangers I hadn't noticed before. Each hesitation brought a rush of relief disguising itself as protection. I wasn't just avoiding failure. I was shielding myself from the unbearable sting of disappointment that had echoed through quieter moments long ago, hidden beneath the surface. One evening, I found myself tangled in this very struggle again. I had an opportunity to pitch a new project, something I had poured weeks of energy into. As the appointment neared, my chest tightened, and doubts flooded my mind like a relentless storm. Could I communicate my vision clearly? Would anyone see the value I saw? Then, an intrusive thought whispered, "What if they think you're not good enough?" It was like an invisible chain pulling me back. I canceled the meeting hours before, convincing myself that postponing was wise. Yet deep inside, I knew this was a subtle form of self-sabotage, an act born from an internal drama I hadn't yet untangled. What's striking to me is how these internal dialogues aren't random. They form intricate scripts woven tightly with past experiences, disguised fears, and sometimes, what I now recognize as a distorted sense of self-worth. At times, our minds erect mental mazes filled with what-ifs and maybes to keep us enclosed. And while this maze offers safety from potential harm, it also traps us in repetitive cycles of retreat and regret. I recall a story my mentor shared about a client named Clara who was brilliant but paralyzed by the fear of success itself, not just failure. Clara feared the responsibility that came with achievement more than losing. It was a revelation for me, something I hadn't considered before. It made me rethink my behaviors. Am I actually avoiding the burden of change, the expectations that come with making it? This fear created a silent sabotage where opportunities were dismissed even before fully exploring them. When I pondered Clara's experience, I realized our struggle often blends discomfort with what psychologist Susan David calls emotional agility, the ability to hold difficult feelings alongside our goals without getting stuck. But without this balance, we end up either fighting emotions imprudently or surrendering to them entirely, leading to a cycle of avoidance. This felt especially true in financial decisions because money isn't just numbers. It's deeply intertwined with identity and survival. Picture, for example, what happens when it's time to review a bank statement or budget. For me, that moment often ignited a surge of tension, an urge to delay or distract myself with less challenging tasks. The numbers felt judgmental, as if reporting back on my competence and worth. In those moments, procrastination morphed from laziness into an emotional defense mechanism, a way of shielding against feelings of inadequacy that might have taken root long before I understood them. One afternoon, trying to confront this head-on, I forced myself to sit down with my finances. As I broke down months of expenses, an unexpected wave of embarrassment washed over me. It was as if I was unveiling a hidden part of myself, not just the spending totals but the story they told about my relationship with control, worry, and fear. Instead of shame, I chose curiosity, asking why certain patterns emerged, what feelings arose when I spent impulsively or held back on investing in myself. This internal detective work revealed another layer. Self-criticism lurking like a shadow, whispering that I didn't deserve abundance or financial freedom. I caught myself rehearsing narratives of unworthiness, even though these were far from factual. Realizing that self-sabotage often dances hand-in-hand with low self-esteem illuminated why breaking its hold feels so complex, because it's entangled with how we see ourselves most fundamentally. I'm reminded of a colleague, Aaron, whose struggle was different but equally revealing. He grew up in a family where financial success was equated with betrayal or greed. So whenever he edged toward prosperity, he'd unconsciously pull back, afraid of becoming the villain in his family's story. His self-sabotage showed up as hesitancy to negotiate raises or accept lucrative projects, sabotaging not the chance of failure, but the chance of isolation from those he loved. Aaron's example highlights how our emotional programming around money can involve conflicting values and loyalties, something I'm still learning to navigate myself. Now, consider how this applies when you face critical financial moments, deciding whether to invest, negotiate, or even ask for help. The impulse to retreat might be signaling a deeper emotional challenge, one woven from fears not usually expressed aloud. Recognizing the emotional foundation beneath those urges invites compassion rather than frustration. It's like stepping into a quiet room that's been locked for years and gently opening the door. Yet understanding alone is insufficient. It reshapes our relationship with these inner barriers into an ongoing dialogue rather than a battle to be won or lost. We begin to see the self-sabotaging impulses not as enemies, but as messages from within, asking to be heard and understood. This shift from judgment to curiosity opens possibilities for change that feel less daunting. As I traverse this path, I remind myself that unraveling these hidden motives is like peeling back layers of an onion. Tears may come, not from failure, but from uncovering truths previously unacknowledged. And with each peel, I discover new strengths, resilience, insight, and the capacity to hold discomfort without collapsing. It is messy, it is tender, and above all, it is deeply human. There was a moment when I noticed how effortlessly I could talk myself out of a promising opportunity, often without any tangible reasons. It happened during an unexpected meetup with an old friend who had recently started her own business. She was glowing with excitement, describing her progress and newfound confidence. As I listened, a familiar tension brewed inside me, familiar yet unsettling. I admired her courage, yet a quiet voice inside began whispering cautions, reminders of previous ventures where hopes unraveled. Suddenly, I felt my enthusiasm retreating like a tide pulling away from the shore. That evening, I realized this habitual retreat was less about external obstacles and more about a covert dialogue rooted in emotional defense, subtly steering my choices before I even recognized the direction. Sometimes, I imagine this internal landscape as an overgrown garden where weeds of doubt and caution have taken root in fertile soil. These plants grow so unchecked that they choke potential blossoms, not because the environment lacks nutrients, but because the gardener, my own heart, hesitates to prune the fears themselves. This garden thrives in the shade cast by previous setbacks, where trust in my abilities feels dimmed by shadows from the past. Each new seed of possibility carries the weight of silent warnings, warnings born of a history tangled with unspoken grievances and vulnerabilities. Once, during a particularly challenging season, I encountered someone whose narrative deepened my understanding. Jake was an artist who dreaded selling his work despite genuine talent and demand. When asked why he held back, he confessed a complex hesitation. The commercial side of success seemed to threaten his authenticity, as if embracing prosperity would betray his artistic soul. I recognized a parallel within myself. Sometimes rejection isn't a rejection of success, but a refusal to abandon important parts of our identity. In Jake's case, the internal conflict created a subtle paralysis. His financial choices became a battleground between aspiration and a protective solitude that insulated him from unfamiliar territory. This dynamic can be as confounding as trying to sail a boat while the anchor remains buried deep beneath. Even when the wind of possibility fills the sails, the vessel hesitates to glide forward because an unseen tether holds it firm. I've felt this reluctance keenly, wanting to advance, but sensing invisible weights pull me back. Sometimes the stakes are so intertwined with personal meaning that moving forward appears to risk far more than tangible loss. It threatens the very foundation of who I believe myself to be. Reflecting on such experiences, it's clear that avoiding risk stems from more than fear of failure alone. There is often a subtle fear of transformation masked beneath. What if the person I become after achieving these goals is unrecognizable? Might newfound success isolate me from those I've shared struggles with? During a conversation with a close confidant, I heard her admit, "Growth terrifies me because if I change, I might lose the part of me that keeps me connected to my roots." This sense of preserving identity, even at the expense of progress, sheds light on why some decisions feel suffocatingly complex behind the surface. On several occasions, I confronted this hesitation directly. For instance, a few months ago, a promising job offer landed on my desk, better pay, aligned with my passions, and an open door to growth. Instead of immediate excitement, waves of uncertainty crashed over me. I recall sitting alone late at night, turning the offer over in my hands, feeling the paradox of exhilaration and trepidation. My mind raced ahead to possible consequences. Would I disappoint old friends who knew me differently? Would the responsibilities overwhelm me? These concerns, unspoken yet visceral, slowed my response and made me hesitate longer than I expected. The turmoil wasn't simply about choice, but about reconciling different parts of myself, a tug-of-war between desire and the comfort of familiarity. This battle plays out in quieter, more subtle ways than outright refusal. For example, sometimes I catch myself dithering over decisions that should be straightforward or fixating on minute imperfections to justify delay. There's a strange comfort in this dance because it masks the vulnerability surrounding deeper fears of change. Through these reflections, I've come to see how the emotional undercurrent beneath financial indecision is often enmeshed with our need for belonging, safety, and congruence in personal identity. When choices feel like they might disrupt long-held emotional equilibrium, resistance naturally intensifies. It's less about rational calculation and more about lingering emotional allegiances that assert influence without explicit permission. In confronting this complex interplay, I find it helps to listen attentively to the internal voices competing for attention, curious, compassionate, and without judgment. Last week, during a journaling exercise, I asked myself what the hesitation really hoped to protect. The answer surprised me. It wanted to safeguard a sense of inner peace, even if that peace came at the cost of stalling progress. Recognizing this tender intention reframed my perspective, from viewing hesitation as a foe to appreciating it as a cautious guardian. When I think about how this applies to your own experience, consider moments you've postponed financial decisions. Instead of immediately judging yourself for indecision or lack of willpower, try to gently explore what protective purposes these hesitations might be serving. Doing so doesn't excuse avoidance, but opens a pathway to understanding the emotional roots beneath. Sometimes, acknowledging these inner protectors is the key to inviting new ways of moving forward that honor both safety and aspiration. The journey isn't linear, and the terrain is often rocky. However, by embracing the nuanced emotions involved, we create space for a richer, more nuanced relationship with ourselves and the choices we face. Like a dance that requires both caution and courage, learning to navigate this interplay delicately yet decisively can transform how we approach opportunity, from a battleground into a field of possibility waiting to be cultivated. There was a time when I stood at a crossroads, torn between the allure of a fresh financial endeavor and an overwhelming inner pull to retreat. The weight pressing down on my chest felt mesmerizingly dense, as if invisible hands gripped my spirit tightly, pulling it backward just as I prepared to step forward. At that moment, my mind conjured a vivid image, a spiderweb spun finely, delicate yet trapping every movement. Every hopeful advance caught and halted before it could unfold. I realized this wasn't merely hesitation. It was an intricate dance of inner forces that whispered warnings and invoked paralysis in equal measure. One evening, amid flickering candlelight and the hum of rain against my window, I revisited a journal from years ago. The ink-stained pages revealed a narrative of yearning and retreat, dreams scribbled but never realized. As I read, I heard an echo from that younger voice inside me. What if I am not meant to succeed? What if trying only brings more pain? Those words weren't fresh doubts. They were ancient echoes resurfacing, grounding themselves stubbornly in my psyche. It struck me clearly. The recurring reluctance wasn't just about risk avoidance, but a deeply rooted conviction shaped through layers of experience, often unspoken and elusive. A friend's story came to mind. Maria, a gifted entrepreneur whose creative brilliance was unmatched, yet she often undermined her own projects with last-minute withdrawals and unreturned emails. One day, we sat in a cozy cafe, steam rising from our mugs as she confessed something unexpected. I fear that if I push too hard, I might prove I'm capable, and then there's no turning back. What happens if I disappoint not just others, but myself this time? Her eyes brimmed with an honesty that pierced the veneer of simple procrastination and exposed a tangled web of vulnerability. It became evident that the discomfort wasn't solely about failing outwardly. It was about confronting expectations that had grown vast and suffocating. This reflection led me to recognize how intricate the web of internal narratives can be, weaving not only caution, but also a fear of transformation itself. When I consider moments where I was on the brink of decisive action but found the strength to halt, it usually involved a clash between the promise of change and a craving for familiar stability, even if that stability meant standing in place. I liken it to a river forced to choose between flowing into uncharted currents or looping back into its known bends. The comfort of the familiar often wins, despite the deeper lure of new horizons. During a particularly restless night, I engaged with this tension by exploring an unplanned exercise. I imagined my future self 5 years ahead. This version of me wore confidence lightly, but carried the gentle scars of battles fought and boundaries redrawn. Yet, as I pictured her, another vision intruded, a hesitant counterpart clinging to worn habits, afraid to relinquish old identities. What fascinated me was not the contrast, but their dialogue. I pictured them seated beside each other, sharing stories of triumphs and fears. This inner conversation helped me grasp that the barriers I faced were not solitary walls, but dynamic negotiations, shaping how eager or resistant I could be toward prosperity and renewal. What struck me even more was how much this internal push-pull mirrors broader themes in life beyond finances. For instance, in our relationships, I have witnessed how fear of losing comfort can keep us tethered even when growth beckons. The pattern is familiar: resistance not because we reject better options, but because shedding old skin summons uncertainty so profound that retreat often appears safer. This realization reshaped how I approached dilemmas about opportunity and security, knowing that an internal balance must be respected, even as it challenges progress. One afternoon, during a spontaneous hike with a close companion, I found clarity in nature's rhythms. We paused atop a ridge, wind teasing leaves in slow dance. My friend remarked, "Look how the trees bend but do not break in the storm. Their resilience is in yielding just enough." That image stayed with me. The idea that strength isn't about rigid force but a fluid responsiveness, a willingness to sway amidst shifting winds without surrendering one's root. Transposing this wisdom to my own journey, I began to realize that my instincts to hesitate were less signs of weakness and more invitations to cultivate flexibility within my ambitions. Now, consider how these reflections resonate when faced with that next decision laden with hope and hesitance. When you're poised to make a move, yet feel invisible barriers wrapped around your resolve, try envisioning those internal dialogues not as opposition, but as necessary negotiations that require patience and empathy. By honoring the complexity within, we make space for transformation that's both authentic and sustainable, growth that embraces uncertainty without being consumed by it. That evening, with journal open and candle flickering low, I wrote a promise to myself: to meet resistance with curiosity rather than confrontation, to listen for the subtle messages beneath inner turmoil, and to trust that within this ebb and flow lies the path toward evolving not despite fear, but alongside it. I remember a chilly afternoon when I sat across from Daniel, an entrepreneur whose success was shadowed by an invisible barrier he struggled to name. He'd launched multiple ventures with great enthusiasm, only to unconsciously steer himself away from opportunities just as they began to show promise. "It's like I'm my own worst adversary without even realizing it," he confessed, his eyes heavy with quiet frustration. What struck me most was the way he described the tension between his aspirations and an inexplicable urge to derail progress before it could threaten to change the delicate balance of his life. As we delved deeper, Daniel revealed a subtle yet profound force shaping his decisions, an ingrained sense of entitlement to suffering, almost as if hardship was the currency he traded for identity. The notion that comfort was somehow unearned haunted him. I could feel the gravity of this belief anchoring him in place, a magnet pulling away from achievement towards what felt safest. It reminded me of an ancient mariner afraid to leave the coastline, despite the vast ocean of possibilities stretching ahead, because the shoreline, though jagged and worn, was known and certain. One afternoon, I returned to my own attempts at progress and saw reflections of Daniel's struggle mirrored in my hesitation. I had been wrestling with a tempting prospect, investing in further education that could expand my skill set. Yet each time I approached the enrollment page, a rush of doubt swept through me, whispering notions of unworthiness and the risk of disrupting my current equilibrium. The internal conversation veered toward impressions shaped long before, where vulnerability was linked inseparably to failure. I realized that this resistance was less about the choices themselves and more about protecting a story internalized early on, that I was meant to endure rather than thrive. This awareness led me to explore how certain unspoken commitments, like a pact with pain, can quietly dictate our behavior. For instance, James, a talented writer I once coached, spoke about how his financial limitations felt like a badge of honor. "If I had money, I'd lose the authenticity that fuels my work," he said softly, almost resisting the idea of abundance. It dawned on me that his hesitancy to embrace material gain was, paradoxically, a way of preserving a cherished self-image forged amid sacrifice and struggle. Somehow, embracing financial ease appeared as a betrayal, a rewriting of his narrative that felt foreign and unsettling. In my own life, this dynamic surfaced during an evening when I confronted yet another postponed financial decision involving negotiating a raise. I recalled the months I spent justifying silence, convincing myself that timing wasn't right or that others were more deserving. The truth was that acknowledgement felt too risky. Acknowledging my own value promised profound shifts in how I saw myself and how others would see me. This shifting identity was unnerving because it demanded stepping beyond passive existence into active claiming of what had long been denied. As the night deepened, I imagined this internal struggle as a pendulum swinging between two states, one rooted in restraint and preservation, the other in expansion and transformation. Each swing was weighted by history and emotional investments that made stepping off balance feel hazardous. At times, I realized the pendulum was sticky, caught in molasses, reluctant to swing fully toward growth. It was not a question of desire, but a tense negotiation between longing for change and fear of losing oneself in the process. One moment of clarity came during a chance conversation with a mentor who described growth as an emotional excavation. She suggested that making space for new abundance often requires digging through layers of prior conditioning, some beautiful and others entangled with limitation. Her words lingered, prompting me to see that what I perceived as resistance was actually a signal, a compass guiding me to areas within that needed attention and healing. Growth, then, was less about forcefully breaking barriers and more about mindful excavation, slow, purposeful, and respectful of the parts of me that feared disintegration. Later, standing at the edge of a bustling farmer's market, I watched a young artisan negotiating prices with customers. She balanced steadfast confidence with sensitivity, adjusting her approach as she read the subtle cues in each interaction. Her dance with uncertainty inspired me. There was grace in her ability to embrace discomfort while maintaining authenticity. It reminded me that navigating the terrain of personal evolution, including financial breakthroughs, demands not only strength but deep attunement to one's own rhythms and boundaries. Progress is rarely a straight path. It winds and curves, shaped by our willingness to engage complex inner landscapes. Now, consider how this applies when you face moments of uncertainty in your own journey. When hesitation arises, rather than dismissing it as weakness, try to observe it as a guide highlighting where foundational beliefs may be quietly exerting influence. These moments are invitations to explore parts of your story that crave recognition and care. Through this lens, the challenge morphs from a battle against oneself into a collaborative unfolding of insight, resilience, and renewed possibility. One evening, as twilight cast long shadows across my cluttered desk, I found myself wrestling with an impulse I hadn't fully understood before. A promising offer had landed unexpectedly, a chance to invest in a project that aligned deeply with my values. Yet as I stared at the contract, a peculiar sensation crept through me, an urge to delay, to find flaws or postpone the decision indefinitely. It wasn't fear of failure in the traditional sense. Instead, it felt like an invisible tether, pulling me back from embracing what could be a turning point. The experience resembled standing before a mirror that reflected not just my image, but a fractured amalgamation of dreams, doubts, and unspoken hesitations. I began probing this experience more closely, recognizing it as a protective mechanism shaped by layers of emotional conditioning. One afternoon, during a walk along a quiet trail, I met Lisa, a former colleague now working in nonprofit leadership. As we navigated the winding path under swaying branches, she confided a striking insight. When I'm on the verge of growth, I sometimes sabotage myself by dismissing my progress as luck or timing, like I don't truly belong in that space. Her confession resonated powerfully. It wasn't only ambition that sparked these retreats, but a deep-seated fear of visibility, the vulnerability that accompanies stepping into the light of success. In this way, hesitation became a subtle shield, guarding fragile self-perceptions by keeping ambitions quietly simmering under the surface. Reflecting on our conversation, I realized these patterns extend beyond just financial choices. They ripple into every arena where identity and uncertainty collide. On a rainy morning while sipping tea, I recalled a mentor's observation. Sometimes, the loudest resistance comes from places of profound hope disguised as doubt. I found myself drawn to this paradox, wondering if my own moments of paralysis were silently nurturing hope, even if buried beneath layers of skepticism. Like a seed trapped under soil, waiting patiently for the right conditions to break through, these reservations demanded gentle attention, not harsh rejection. There's something deeply human about this inner push and pull. I picture it as a weathered bridge spanning a turbulent river, swaying precariously but holding strong under pressure. Crossing it requires courage, yes, but also trust that the bridge, or I, won't collapse midway. This metaphor echoed back to me during a quiet evening when I revisited journal entries from years past, noting how similar doubts and near decisions threaded through my financial history. Each stumble wasn't just failure. It was a place marked with emotional friction, where longing clashed with hesitation. The bridge was shaky not due to lack of desire, but because traversing it meant confronting the unknown terrain awaiting on the other side. In a more practical sense, I began experimenting with incremental steps, small acts of courage that nudged me forward without demanding grand leaps. One morning, I challenged myself to respond to a neglected business inquiry that had lingered unanswered for weeks. The email felt like opening a hidden door, exposing nerves and possibilities all at once. Although I feared rejection, I also sensed something else. Relief, as if a weight began lifting from my shoulders. That simple reply led to a meaningful conversation and renewed momentum, demonstrating that opening a crack could let in fresh air where stale patterns had settled. Engaging with these moments illuminated another subtle element, the tendency to conflate self-worth with outcomes. I noticed that I often measured my value by whether a venture succeeded or faltered, eclipsing the courage embedded in the attempt itself. Shifting this lens wasn't instantaneous, but gradually I learned to honor the vulnerability involved in risking, even when the outcomes remained uncertain. This reframing brought an unexpected grace, like realizing that the dance is meaningful even if the steps aren't perfect. Now, picture how this echoes in your own experience. Maybe when facing a financial choice, you feel similarly tugged between excitement and restraint. These feelings send signals, not barriers, that invite you to explore the deeper narratives wired through years of experience. Embracing this complexity allows you to navigate forward with compassionate awareness, transforming hesitation from a stumbling block into a guidepost toward authentic growth. At times, I envision this journey as a tide's rhythm, sometimes pulling back to gather strength, sometimes surging forward with renewed energy. Each retreat is purposeful, preparing the next push. Recognizing this cyclical flow helped me cultivate patience for my process. Instead of rushing against resistance, I learned to move in harmony with it, trusting that persistence compounded through steady steps leads not just to external gains, but a profound internal shift. That night, as I closed my journal, I felt a quiet promise taking root. To honor the mystery within my hesitations, to step bravely into uncertainty, and to celebrate progress measured by courage rather than achievement alone. I still recall the sharp pang that hit me during a business meeting when I found myself shrinking away from an opportunity others clearly saw as promising. The room was alive with energized plans, numbers on the whiteboard detailing projections I'd helped draft, yet my mind was spiraling into quiet objections no one else seemed to notice. My voice faltered when it came time to speak up, my usual clarity clouded by an unsettling inner resistance. It dawned on me then. There was a line between knowing what to do and feeling able to do it, and on that day, the latter was engulfed in shadows I hadn't even acknowledged. This experience nudged me toward deeper curiosity about why, in critical moments, I sometimes become my own saboteur's accomplice, weaving a subtle web that ensnares my intentions beneath layers of unconscious hesitation. Instead of focusing solely on conscious choice, I started to explore what I now call the emotional fog, an invisible, claustrophobic atmosphere coating my perceptions, distorting what seems possible. It's like trying to pilot a plane on a night with nothing but dim moonlight, instruments flickering uncertainly, and the horizon lost in thick clouds. The path is there, but the senses fail to guide steadily. Invoking memories from years ago, I met Elena, a creative professional whose trajectory was dazzling on the surface, yet repeatedly interrupted by patterns of withdrawal she found mysterious. We talked about moments when her confidence would plummet unexplainably just before signing contracts or launching new products. She described it as a ghost grip, an unseen force tightening around her chest and pulling her back into a familiar cocoon of safety. Intrigued by her words, I realized that some emotional weights act like hidden anchors, quiet but immensely heavy, rooting us to stagnant soil when we yearn to bloom. During an afternoon dedicated to reflection, I peppered my journal with questions. What stories had I collected about who I am in relation to success? Which past experiences sneak into present decisions, casting long shadows? Answers surfaced gradually, sometimes almost silent. For instance, I uncovered a thread of internalized messages that equated financial progress with loss of identity, of safety nets, or of belonging. This revelation reminded me of a tightrope walker balancing precariously. The fear isn't just falling, but losing equilibrium altogether, the exact thing that holds the audience's breath. I also recognized that in unfamiliar territory, lack of clarity breeds distrust, not only of circumstance, but of oneself. I remembered a colleague, Malik, a brilliant mind who consistently postponed salary negotiations, fearing that advocating too strongly would label him as difficult or greedy. His reluctance wasn't mere hesitation. It stemmed from deeply embedded narratives where assertiveness triggered feelings of shame and disconnection. Watching him navigate these turbulent emotions introduced me to the notion that the battlefield isn't strategies or goals, but internalized rules about worth and belonging that shape every move we make. When I grappled with similar feelings, I tried to dismantle the invisible scripts enmeshed in my thinking through deliberate small acts of defiance against familiar paralysis. For example, I would deliberately allocate tiny portions of my budget toward risky investments or exploratory projects, treating these moves not as commitments but experiments. These experiments became my laboratory, yielding data about my emotional responses and allowing me to thaw frozen attitudes by permission, not force. It felt like practicing to walk on ice that once seemed too treacherous. Each cautious step built confidence and awareness, deepening my capacity to stand firm amid uncertainty. During these explorations, I encountered a powerful metaphor, the mind as a vast cave with pockets illuminated by selective light. Sometimes, fear dwells in the darkened corners that we prefer to ignore, but rather than avoiding these spaces, I began to explore them like an archaeologist uncovering forgotten relics. In excavating old memories and feelings, I found surprising treasures, moments of resilience and insight that had been overshadowed by louder fears. That process reminded me that hidden beneath resistance, there often lies a spark waiting for nourishment and air. Now, consider how this unfolds when you stand before a hard choice. Whether investing in your education, applying for a new position, or stepping into an entrepreneurial venture. That subtle hesitation could signal the presence of old emotional caverns calling out for your attention. Instead of rushing to silence these feelings, allow them space to be witnessed. Shift your posture from adversary to compassionate explorer. In doing so, you may begin to transform these areas from sources of paralysis into fertile grounds for growth that honors where you have been and where you long to go. Reflecting on this, I came to appreciate that courage is often less a sudden surge and more a slow-burning flame fueled by patience and self-honesty. When I learned to move gently into uncertainty, respecting my internal weather instead of battling it, I found new rhythms of trust emerging. Trust not in perfection, but in my ability to adapt, recover, and engage authentically, no matter the outcome. Embracing these nuances reshaped my understanding of progress. It's less about a straight line toward success and more like navigating a meandering river, sometimes swift and clear, other times misted and uncertain, yet always flowing as long as I am willing to move with it. This shift invites us into a dynamic partnership with ourselves, forging resilience and wisdom through exploration rather than confrontation. I remember the sharp ache of frustration gripping me one morning when, yet again, I found myself hesitating over a financial decision that could have propelled me forward. The idea was promising, a steady investment with a reasonable risk, carefully researched. But at the last minute, I convinced myself to step back, citing vague uncertainties that swirled more around emotion than facts. It struck me as odd, a peculiar dance between eagerness and retreat. In that moment, I realized self-sabotage wasn't a simple snap decision, but a complex interplay of perceptions lodged deep within. Delving into this inner conflict led me to examine not only my fears, but the subtle ways my self-image constrains my financial moves. One of my closest friends, Ava, once shared with me her experience of financial invisibility. Despite excelling professionally, she felt undeserving of money flowing toward her. She confessed, "Sometimes I act as if my success is accidental, like I stumbled into it rather than earned it." Her honesty unveiled a crucial psychological mechanism, a dissonance between how we see ourselves and the financial realities we pursue. This incongruence forms a breeding ground for self-sabotage, creating invisible barricades erected by internal narratives that question our legitimacy. It reminded me of a personal episode where I hesitated before negotiating a contract, despite being skilled and prepared. A voice inside murmured doubts about my worthiness, whispering that claiming value might lead to rejection or alienation. As I pushed through, I became aware that this voice was a guardian of an older scar, a scar from years when I internalized criticism that success equals selfishness. This tangled knot forced me to face the uncomfortable truth. Self-sabotage frequently masquerades as protection of identity when, in reality, it prolongs stagnation. Building on this, I uncovered another layer: cognitive distortions that sway financial behavior. I caught myself engaging in all-or-nothing thinking, believing that if one plan failed, the whole endeavor was doomed. This binary lens skewed my perception, making minor setbacks feel like catastrophic proof of incompetence. I saw similar tendencies in Marcus, a colleague who avoided long-term financial planning because previous failures warped his expectations. His experience illustrated how a mind burdened with exaggerated fears struggles to embrace incremental progress, each misstep interpreted as a definitive end rather than a stepping stone. To confront this, I began a practice of reframing setbacks as valuable feedback, not terminal verdict. To counter this, I recalled a practice from a mentor who urged embracing imperfect action. We don't need to wait for readiness or certainty to begin moving forward. Instead, taking small, messy steps builds momentum and dismantles the paralysis of perfection. If you find yourself caught in cycles of second-guessing or freezing before decisions, I invite you to explore these hidden layers, the silent self-judgments, the identity anxieties, the distorted thought patterns, and bodily signals warning of emotional threats.